Armored Core 6 is coming from Software, the developers of, the Dark Souls, Elden Ring, all of that. Although this is a mech fighting game. And, From Software has an interesting history with their PC ports not always being great. Even Elden Ring, which is one of my favorite games, had a 60 frames per second cap, had some stuttering issues, all of that. So I'm really excited by a few things that we're seeing here from Armored Core 6 now that we're getting official system requirements as well as some additional information. Now, this game will be coming out on August 24th for PC at 10 p.m. UTC, and then August 25th on consoles. This is also a cross-gen console game, meaning that we shouldn't see it as incredibly demanding on lower-end PCs as we do in the latest current-gen console only titles. Now, you see a little bit of gameplay behind me here, and you can take a look. I'll link all my sources in the video description. A couple of things I want to bring up to note before we get into the system requirements is I was desperate to find out in a faster-paced, flying around mech action game, if From Software kept a 60 FPS cap like they did in Elden Ring on PC, I was going to be extremely disappointed. So I have discovered that the graphics option menu of Armored Core 6 is an article at overclocked.net, which I will post in the video description again, has had a look at the graphics options on PC, and it does give a frame rate limit of 120 FPS as an option, which I am very excited to see. In most games, it would just be a given that you could on PC that you could run past that point, but From Software in the past has not given us that option on their PC ports. There's some other graphical options that you can take a look at here. Again, this article will be in the video description, but let's get to the main information for this video. How about those system requirements? So this just came from a tweet or X or whatever the heck we're supposed to call it now from the developers, and we see system requirements listed with both ray tracing off and ray tracing on. This game does seem to have ray tracing options, although it does mention right down here that ray tracing is only available in the garage area of the game, so not during actual gameplay. Also, if you were hoping to run, DLSS or FSR or anything like that, the same article, to help you, boost those frame rates, especially with ray tracing enabled. While we see ray tracing options in the game, there does not appear to be any options for FSR, DLSS, or XeSS upscaling technologies, which is disappointing to see. And that's the same thing as when Elden Ring got its ray tracing patch. It did greatly increase the graphical demands, although that was during actual gameplay, not just in the garage area like we're seeing here. It also didn't come with those upscaling technologies. So while it's nice to see the increase to 120 FPS limit and additions of features like ray tracing, it would be nice if we also, got some upscaling technologies available to go with that, but maybe we won't need them because the system requirements here actually don't look too crazy. Should we start with ray tracing on or ray tracing off? How about ray tracing off? You don't care about turning on ray tracing, you just want to play the game. We get some minimum and recommended system specs. Now, I will say that it's disappointing. Here's another place where I think they have room to improve. A lot of big games on PC nowadays give their system recommendations, giving us a lot more information, like what frame rate, graphical settings, and monitor resolution is it targeting when it says minimum or recommended. Because for a lot of games, minimum ends up meaning something like 720p, lowest settings, 30 frames per second, and recommended might be, 1080p, 60 frames per second at high settings, something like that. But they don't tell us that here. And I'm suspicious that there's not as big of a gap here between these as you might initially think, and that's because if we look at the difference between the minimum and recommended specs on the GPU side of things, here we've got a GTX 1650 4GB and an Radeon RX 480 4GB listed as the minimums. And then the recommended are just jumping up to a GTX 1060 6GB version. They do specifically list, so it does look like you want at least 4GB of VRAM on your GPU for a good experience in this game. And it says, or the Radeon RX 590 8GB or Intel Arc A750 8GB. Now I'm going to jump over to another site over here. Sorry if I just blinded you. This is the Tech Power Up GPU database. One thing this lets us do is look up, a lot of specs, like the GTX 1650 is a 4GB card, all of that. But they also have a relative performance database. And I do need to be clear that this is not 100% accurate, especially on a game-by-game basis. And I don't think it's always updated in the, the latest games and drivers and all of that. And individual games can vary wildly between how GPUs stack up. However, that being said, this does give you a general ballpark idea of how different GPUs compare. This will also be in the video description, so if your GPU is not listed, you can find it in this database. Click on it, that will set it as a 100% baseline, and then you can see how other GPUs stack up against that. Interestingly, we did not see the Intel Arc A380 listed as a minimum spec GPU, although this relative performance chart has it performing similarly to a GTX 1650. And they did include an Intel Arc A750 in their recommended specs, so I do find that at least a little bit interesting. The RX 480 also, if I scroll up, is generally a bit more powerful than the 1650. But again, these could just be the GPUs that they have available in their test systems on their minimum rigs, and they're just saying, okay, these work out. But what's a bit interesting then is that the recommended specs just jump up to a GTX 1060 6GB, and the 1060 is not generally that much more powerful than an RX 480, although they are specifying a difference between 4GB and the 6GB card on the GTX 1060, so perhaps it's more VRAM related on how they're jumping to these recommendations. And then if you jump up to the other AMD GPU mentioned, the RX 590, they're now listing an 8GB version of that card. And the RX 590 is a 41% bump from the GTX 1650, which was the minimum. But from the RX 480, which was another minimum list from the AMD GPU, the 590 is not that much more powerful. We're seeing it listed at about 15% on this particular chart. Again, it can vary differently game by game or anything like that. So again, it could just be a VRAM difference in the settings, because again, not a huge difference from the 480 to the 590, and not a huge difference from the 1650 to the 1060 6GB. I mean, there is a difference, but it's not enough to explain, so this is where I'd have to speculate, because they're not giving us a resolution or graphics settings or frame rate target, right? So there's not a huge jump from minimum to recommended, not enough to explain a difference from like 30 FPS to 60 FPS, or even a difference from 720p low to 1080p medium, right? So perhaps we're looking at 1080p low 30 and 1080p high 30, or maybe we're looking at maybe. I mean, I don't know. Like, again, this is where I really wish that they could give us some more details here on the exact graphic settings they're recommending here. We'll talk more about the CPUs in a second. They are listing a minimum memory requirement of 12 gigabytes of RAM, not VRAM, system memory, right? So it looks like if you're on an 8 gigabyte system, perhaps that would be a problem, or perhaps this is just what's in their test system. Now, if we jump up to the ray tracing on requirements, we're still only seeing 12 gigabytes of RAM, and we're seeing exactly the same CPU specs. I was jumping between these back and forth, looking for any difference between the CPUs on the ray tracing off and ray tracing on requirements, and I don't see any differences. Ray tracing can increase the burden on the CPU, as well as a lot of times, the GPU and the VRAM requirements, depending on how much, ray tracing they're doing. So we'll talk about the CPUs again a little bit at the end, but first let's talk ray tracing GPUs. So the first thing that jumps out to me is their minimum ray tracing GPUs are just the weakest ray tracing GPU from each brand. The oldest GPUs, older GPUs didn't have hardware accelerated ray tracing. It was NVIDIA with their RTX 20 series, and the lowest GPU there being the 2060 that introduced ray tracing support, and that's the minimum GPU listed here. And AMD's Radeon RX 6000 series began their ray tracing support, and the RX 6600 was the original one launched at that point, although I think, you do have like the 6500 and 6400, which I think have crippled VRAM capacities, which could be part of the issue here, and are just much weaker GPUs. So I was originally going to say it's the weakest RT GPU from each of these, but I honestly forgot for a second there was a 6400 and a 6500 from the 6000 series. But anyway, so that's what we're seeing here on those requirements. So 2060 and 6600. Again, I have a feeling like, well, even though that does, okay, so again, if we go up from like our, GTX 1060 baseline, something like that, and we scroll up to find the, you might be finding your GPU, I should get my head out of the way. You might be finding your GPU somewhere in this list, right? Somewhere in between. But if you want to enable ray tracing, you do need to get to a GPU that does have support for it, and that's what we're seeing here with the RTX 2060. How would the 3050 perform? Good question. Maybe they just didn't have one on hand to test, because I would be curious. The 3050 does tend to be a bit weaker than the 2060. And the RX 6600 does tend to perform similarly to an RTX 2060 when you're not using ray tracing. Usually with a ray tracing workload enabled, the RTX 2060 could pull ahead. But this could just be a very light ray tracing implementation. Anyway, jumping up to the recommended ray tracing GPUs, we jump up to an RTX 2070 or a Radeon RX 6650 XT, or they throw in the Intel Arc A770. And they specifically list the 16 gigabyte version, although maybe that's just what they're testing. There is an 8 gigabyte version of the A770, which might make sense here, again, since the other two cards also have an 8 gigabyte limit here from AMD and NVIDIA. Now, going from the 2060 and the RX 6600 to the, was it 27? It wasn't 2070 Super, right? Yeah, just a 2070. So from the 2060 up to the 2070 is not a massive performance increase. We're seeing about 14% right here. And then the 6650 XT is a bigger step up from that difference here. Although in ray tracing support, it would not usually be listed ahead of the RTX 2070. Again, depending on how heavy the ray tracing implementation is. Usually, the heavier the ray tracing implementation, the further ahead the NVIDIA GPU pulls, and in lighter ray tracing workloads, they might come out more evenly. So this is pointing to me as being a light ray tracing workload. It's only in the garage segment of the game anyway. Last thing I'll mention before we go is the CPUs, which again I said were showing as identical between the RT on and RT off settings. This is kind of interesting because they're listing two different Intel CPUs and two AMD CPUs at both the minimum and the recommended. What it seems like to me is they're going with an older but higher end CPU along with a newer but more mid-range CPU. And they're doing that again for both the minimum and recommended, where you see an older, higher-end CPU and then a more mid-range but newer CPU. If we want to look at the specific details, the minimum requirements from Intel are a 4790K. The 4790K, let me slide out of the way here, was a 4-core, 8-thread processor from quite a while ago. This came out in 2014. So not asking for a whole lot there. 2014 chip, although it is one of the higher end chips from 2014. But then the other one they're listing as a minimum requirement is the i5-8400, which is a 6-core, 6-thread mid-range processor from 2017. So jumping to a newer but more mid-range chip there. The AMD minimum requirements are listing are the Ryzen 7 1800X, which is an 8-core, 16-thread higher-end CPU from the first generation of Ryzens, which was 2017. And then they're listing the Ryzen 5 2600, so from the next generation of Ryzens, but dropping down to a more mid-range chip. This is 6-core, 12-thread. And from from 2018. So that's the minimum system requirements. I will say these CPUs, I've seen minimum requirements with lower CPUs for sure. I'll be curious how low these can go, because again, a lot of times system requirements are just the developer will have so many test systems, I think, set up and running with various GPUs. So sometimes I think you see them listing, okay, we've confirmed it works on this. It doesn't mean it couldn't work on something, a little bit lower or something like that. Their recommended systems we're jumping up to an i7-7700 from Intel as the older but higher end one. So i7-7700 was a 4-core, 8-thread chip from 2017. And then they're jumping up to a newer but mid-range chip with the i5-10400, which is 6-core, 12-thread. And this one came out in 2020. On the AMD side of things, for the recommended specs on the CPUs, they're going with the Ryzen 7 2700X for the older but higher end 8-core, 16-thread chip from, looks like 2018. And then a Ryzen 5 3600, which is again, newer but more mid-range 6-core, 12-thread. And the release date on that one being 2019. All right, I wish there was more in terms of the actual resolution and frame rates and exact graphical settings that these were targeting, but unfortunately this is all the info I can get you right now. Again, at least it does look like we're getting 120 FPS this time from Software, so that's at least a step in the right direction. Although, again, it would be nice to see more upscaling options, more PC-centric features, all of that. And it's nice to get the system requirements list with some amount of detail here, but again, more detail would be appreciated. Are you guys interested in me benchmarking this game when it does launch on the 24th? Question mark, let me know. I hope all of you have an excellent day.